This morning we're picking up with the keys to the book of Proverbs. Keys to the book of Proverbs. In the opinion of J. Vernon McGee, the key verse to this book is chapter 1, verse 7. Would you read that?
Fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction.
And I would tend to agree with that. I think if you had to pick one verse for the whole book of Proverbs, that would be it. Solomon is teaching his son to fear God, and that'll help you be a wise person. If you don't, you're a fool. Of course, the details in the remainder of the book of Proverbs are there to illustrate the depths and the varieties of foolishness. But this is the main point. A few other specific passages I'll give to you as key verses, depending on what topic you're concerned with. Some of these passages are highlights in the book. I would take the first 7 verses of the book as the sort of general foundation for the whole book. Verse 7 is merely the capstone, but the first 7 verses of this book show us the purposes and the sequential experience that a person goes through if you follow God's way. The purposes of the Proverbs are to show wisdom. I think that you could draw a pyramid based on the first 7 verses of this of the book of Proverbs, similar to the kind of pyramids that psychologists draw and educators draw. For instance, it's been said that in human experience there are various levels of friendships and acquaintances. First you have a casual acquaintance, right? And then, I forget the exact terminology, then you have a friend, say a mutual friend, and then somebody that you can talk to about, say, more intimate problems and issues, and then ultimately someone that you can trust in any situation, depend on in difficult times. John Piaget, Swiss psychologist, developed 4 different stages of cognitive learning. At least this was his theory, right? The infancy mode, and then pre-adolescence, and then adolescence, and then adulthood. And he believed that everybody goes through the same stages in the same sequence, perhaps not at the exact same time, but there's always scope and sequence to learning, and Solomon in this book, I believe, illustrates the same scope and sequence in teaching us wisdom and the progress that you will follow if you yield to it. I think he starts out by saying that everybody is basically a babe. It fits the baby mentality or concept of the New Testament. A baby has general knowledge, very general, nothing too specific. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel, to know wisdom and instruction. There it is. To perceive the words of understanding, just have basic knowledge, basic perceptions. The next stage would be what we call the growth stage in a Christian, a growing Christian, where a person is developing the ability to discern and is learning how to make certain decisions, to be able to devise his way, to receive the instruction, verse 3, of wisdom, righteousness, and justice, to give prudence to the simple, and to the young man knowledge and discretion. Those two verses describe the middle ground. Those words there, if you do a study on them, prudence refers to your ability to devise your way in the Hebrew. And then the highest level in the scope is indicated in verses 5 and 6. If you follow through, a wise man will listen and will increase learning. A man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels, to understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and the dark sayings. So ultimately you'll be able to have deep discernment. And when it says shall attain unto wise counsels, it's not being able to understand others' counsels there. It means to be able to give counsel yourself. It means to be able to direct the activities of other people. So there's the first 7 verses of this of the Proverbs are stated. Here's the scope and sequence. This is the course of instruction. This is where we want you to aim at. I think it's important to understand that. We can preach a good message on that. Another set of key verses I would say are verses 8 and 9. Chapter 1, verses 8 and 9. In these verses we have the greatest single issue of childhood. The greatest single issue of childhood. And that is whether or not you're going to follow the godly instruction of your parents or substitute it with something else. And this is a theme first stated here that runs all the way through the book of Proverbs. We'll touch on that when we get to key words. All kinds of my son references in this book. This is the first one. But it's important because it's the greatest single issue of childhood. Obedience or rebellion to your parents. I would say, just from my own study of this book, that chapter 4, verses 14 to 27 is probably one of the key sections in the book because it teaches you how to stay on track. Once you're on the right way, there are certain principles stated there to keep you on the right track. If you just look at the imperatives, it'll give you an idea. Enter not into the path of the wicked. Avoid it. Attend to my words. Don't let them depart from your eyes. Keep your heart. That really fits with what you were preaching to the young people about there. Keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. So your heart, he talks about the whole person here. Your heart, your mouth, in verse 24, your lips, your eyes. Let your eyes look right on. And then your feet. Ponder the path of your feet. Turn not to the left or the right. The person who just follow those instructions every day when they get out of bed, you never have a problem. How to stay on track. And that sort of advice comes up frequently. This is the major statement of it in the book, but many times you have Solomon harks back to this particular point. Chapter 6 has 3 separate passages that deal with 3 separate subjects, and I don't know whether you want to put them down as key verses or not. 6, 1 to 11 is his first major passage in the book on sluggery and slothfulness. Major statement. If you be surety for your neighbor, you're snared. Do this and deliver yourself. Really good financial advice here. Give not sleep to your eyes. Go to the ant, consider her ways. So basically, Solomon is saying in this passage that if you want to be, if you don't want to be tricked and trapped in this life financially, you have to work hard. You have to be wise about your relationships. Don't sign your name, and work hard. In verses 12 to 19, in the same chapter 6, verses 12 to 19, his focus is on worthless people. When I preached on this, I called this what it means to be a welfare case. And God certainly doesn't want his people to be welfare cases. The word worthless person there in verse 12, in the Hebrew is naval. Naval. And that's precisely the same word that was used as a proper name for Abigail's husband, the one that David married. His name was Nabal. It was just really it was the same Hebrew word, Naval. And remember when she called him a worthless person, the son of Belial? In the King James, a son of Belial is just a transliteration or something. It was like, it just means the same thing, a worthless person. Welfare case.
Is that a naughty person?
Yeah, a naughty person. It's the same thing as a worthless person. In the New Testament, the term is used, son of Belial. Well, in both the Old and New Testament. And so we have the characteristics of this person. To wink with your eyes means that the person is less than honest. Same thing with speaking with the feet and teaching with the fingers. It's a heart problem. So what is it, 12 to 19. Right. Those descriptions are frequently used in the remainder of Scripture. Here's the first specific statement of many of them. Verses 20 to 35 in this book, or in this chapter, talks about rebellious people. It's quite a... Chapter 5 and Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 of the book of Proverbs all deal with sex, but from completely different perspectives. Chapter 5, I was going to talk about this under key chapters, but it talks about basically the good life versus the pit sort of thing, Sex is good in its boundaries. It's terrible in the wrong way. In Chapter 6, he's talking about the same subject in terms of rebellion. He starts out talking about your mother and your father and listening to what they have to say. And the reason you should is because in verse 24, they're trying to keep you from the evil woman, And so it's couched completely from the perspective of rebellion. The person rebels, and he'll experience all that kind of stuff. Chapter 7, it's not rebellion, it's temptation. It's a completely different angle. The temptation to be a fornicator. But anyway, I've kind of got ahead of myself. So rebellion against parents is the key to chapter 6, verses 20 to 35. As far as key chapters, let's move on to that. I suppose we should add to the key verses the last chapter of, is it Proverbs 31, verses 10 to 31. Description of the extinct woman. Maybe you could do something on Proverbs 31 for Vicky.
Yeah.
The extinct woman. Chapter 1, I would say, is a key chapter. It compares God's way to man's way. We've already touched on the first 9 verses. But if you're familiar at all with the first chapter, from chapter 1, verse 10 to the end of that chapter is the other side. If you don't listen to your parents and to God, you know, the only alternative you have is to listen to other people, you know, your peers, your friends, wicked people. You know, it's almost like Psalm 1, you know, the way of the righteous versus the way of the wicked. And Proverbs 1 is identical. It's just in more detail. So Psalm 1 and Proverbs 1 are really parallel passages. Let me just read a couple of verses out of that to illustrate it. The next thing he says in chapter 1, my son, verse 10, if sinners entice thee, consent thou not. If they say, come with us, let us wallow. Verse 12, cast thy lot in among us. Don't walk in their path, my son. Their feet run to evil. So are the ways of everyone who is greedy of gain. See? So the whole point of the whole first chapter is to compare basically the two only alternatives that a person has if you're going to grow up. You're either going to go one way or the other way. I think it's a key chapter. Chapter 2 is a key chapter because the theme of this book is wisdom. We've already seen that in the first 7 verses of the first chapter, but the second chapter shows that if you want to get it, here are the conditions. Chapter 1, verses 1 to 7 showed the purpose of the Proverbs was to give you these things, and it showed the scope and sequence. Now we have the conditions. If you want this, then you have to lay it up and incline your ear and apply your heart and cry after knowledge and lift up your voice and seek her like silver. You know, here's the preconditions and the benefits of it. So the second chapter, I think, is a key chapter because it shows the preconditions and also the privileges that come with wisdom. Chapter 3, I don't know, you put chapters 3 and 4 together, the blessings of being a believer. I was just going to go through that, and I can't remember it off out of my head. The first 12 verses of this chapter show the blessings of including the Lord in your life. And for each of these promises or principles that Solomon talks about, that he always comes back and shows the benefit of it. My son, don't forget my law. Let your heart keep my commandments. Why? Because they'll give you a length of days. And then verse 3, don't let mercy and truth forsake thee. Why? So shalt thou find favor. Verses 5 and 6, trust in the Lord, lean not unto your own understanding, acknowledge him in all your ways. Why? He shall direct your paths. Verse 7, don't be wise in your own eyes. Why? It'll be health to your navel, marrow to your bones. Then honor the Lord with everything you have. Why? You'll be blessed in your substance. Don't despise the Lord's chastening. Why? Because it shows his love to you. You know? So God gives reasons for what he does, and what he's basically inferring in these first 12 verses is that if you include the Lord in your life, you'll be blessed. And it's just, I think that's really there all the way through this second chapter. See what the next division was. supremacy of divine wisdom in verses 13 to 20, short section. He lists all the blessing, the incomparable blessings of living by God's Word. You get happiness in verse 13, 14 and 15, better things than gold. Verse 16, long life and riches and honor. 17, you have pleasantness and peace. 18 and 20, life and happiness. So he's still talking about blessings. Verses 21 to 26, the security of living by God's Word. You have a challenge in verse 21 to 26. In 21, in the blessings, you get life and grace, security in your path, confidence and sleep. Some confidence and sleep. You would think of that as a blessing. Be able to go to bed at night, relax. Assurance and protection from the unexpected. In verses 27 to 35 in this chapter, well, this brings us to the end. 27 to 35, you have the blessings of a separated life. He lists the things that the godly person should not practice. I never preached on this, but I made an outline of it. Verses 27 to 31, we shouldn't withhold good when you have a debt to pay. Shouldn't hesitate to minister. Verse 28, when you're able to do it and prepared. Don't plot against your neighbor. Don't fight against innocent people. And don't try to follow the example of oppressors. So separate yourself, in other words, from these kinds of practices. Don't do these things. They're all negative, right? Then 32 to 35, the reasons. God can't stand it. And it's really a comparison between good and bad all the way through. In verse 32, it's perverse versus the righteous, wicked versus the just, scoffers versus the lowly, fools versus wise. So chapter 3 is kind of an important chapter because it shows the blessings of being a believer, separated unto God. Chapter 5, for the pitfalls and the pleasures of sex. I want to just survey that because we won't be coming back to it, I doubt. Had a lot of people came to church quite a bit. We had big crowds. Were you there? Yeah. A lot of people came to the church when we got into chapters 5 of Proverbs. So we'll find the outline here. So the whole chapter is devoted to sexual satisfaction, the wrong and the right way to get it. I entitled the message Sex Appeals because the chapter is basically a series of appeals on the subject of sex. The first 6 verses is the first appeal. And the reason for that appeal is because of the problem of evil women. And this is written from the context of instruction from a father to his son rather than a mother to her daughter. So the appeal is in verse 1 and 2. Attend to my wisdom, bow your ear to my understanding, that you may regard discretion and your lips may keep knowledge. Why? For. And if you go through verses 3 to 6, you have the 3 attributes of an evil woman. Her speech, her downhill lifestyle, and her instability. She won't last. This needs to be preached, over and over. The second appeal is in verses 7 to 14. And the reason he makes this appeal is because of the evil effects of fornication, getting sex the wrong way. 7 to 14, the appeal. First, hear me now, therefore, O children, depart not from the words of my mouth. Remove thy way far from her. Come not near the door of her house. Those are the imperatives. Now, this is what will happen if you don't. Less and less and less, Here are the consequences. The after effects of potentially yielding to sin, you lose your honor, your wealth, your health, and your mental health. And he gives his own testimony. Verse 14. Verses 15 to 19, you have the third appeal. And he makes this third appeal because of the pleasures of legitimate sex. The appeal is found in verse 15. Drink waters out of your own cistern, running waters out of your own well. He describes it, let. Those are the appeals. And the reason why is 18b and 19b. Because it's satisfying. You can't get a much better description of satisfying sex than in the 5th chapter of Proverbs. And then in verses 20 to 23, the fourth appeal is made because of the problem of spiritual ruin. It's possible. What Solomon has to say is that sex isn't something that's done in private between two people. It's always a spiritual thing. God is always watching you, even there. Isn't that interesting? Verse 21. I bet you lots of people have memorized that verse. The ways of man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he pondereth all his going. Yeah, that's a good verse, isn't it? In the context. The only thing it refers to is a person's sexual life. He pondereth all his goings. And the possibility is to be, it's possible to fail, so do it right, don't do it wrong. There's a very interesting word picture there, I remember. Should be held with the cords of his sins. The Hebrew word for cords, there, what verse is that? In 22, should be held with the cords of his sins. The Hebrew word for that is kabel, and it's probably behind the English word cable. You'd be held by the cables of your sins. A cable is made up of many small strands. Only many small little habits, and you get them all together. It's quite a principle there. All right. So I said before that chapter 5 is showing you the two possibilities. You have basically two options when it comes to sex: the good option and the bad option. In chapter 6, he's talking about the consequences of rebelling. I'm not going to go back over that because we've already touched on it. In chapter 7, we didn't touch on this. The whole concept regarding sex is how temptation to sex comes, and man, the whole chapter is dealing with the temptation aspect. He starts by telling the story. That he looked out his window and he saw some young guy that got picked up on the street by some woman, and he took her to her house. And he describes this woman, verse 10, with the clothes of a harlot, the heart of a harlot, and the speech of a harlot, and says this is, you can tell, basically what he's saying is, and so we have her big spiel here and how she seduces him, and it's all describing the temptations. What the temptation for this actually, how it comes and what it's like. Chapters 8 and 9 are key chapters in the book of Proverbs because it talks about wisdom 96 times in these two chapters. 96 times. Let's move on to the key words. Key words in the book of Proverbs. The word understanding is found 54 times. Wise is found 65 times. Wise. Wisdom is found 54 times. Instruction, 25 times. Knowledge, 42 times. Fool, 37 times. Fools, plural, 19 times. Foolish, 83 times. I counted them up when I was doing this series on Proverbs. There are over 1,000 references to the combined themes of wisdom, knowledge, understanding, and discernment in the Bible. Over 1,000 references. And if you count them up, over 40% of those references are found in this one book. Over 40% of the Bible's 1,000 plus references to these themes are found in the book of Proverbs. While we're on the subject of key words, there are three main words that are used by Solomon in the book of Proverbs for fools. If you want to give them to you. The first one is pronounced evil. I suppose you'd write it like the word evil in English. That's what it sounds like in Hebrew, evil, or E-B-I-L. An evil. This kind of a person is basically unteachable. He just doesn't want to listen. 27:22 is an example. Though thou shouldst crush a fool in a mortar among grain with a pestle, yet will not his foolishness depart from him. It's pretty graphic. The next kind of a character is a Kasil. Kasil. This kind of a fool, there is little hope for him. We're in chapter 27, just in the 26th chapter, verses 1, 4 to 6, 10 to 12. As snow in summer and as rain in harvest, so honor is not fitting for a fool. A whip for the horse, a bridle for the ass, and a rod for the fool's back. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou also be like him. Answer a fool according to his own folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. It's not that this person is beyond hope, it's just that there is little hope. He that sendeth a message by the hand of a Kasil cuts off the feet and drinks damage. The legs of the lame are not equal. So is a parable in the mouth of Kasils. He that bindeth a stone in a sling, so is he that giveth honor to a fool. You're just setting yourself up. As a thorn goes up into the hand of a drunkard, so is a parable in the mouth of Kasils. You just don't want to trust this kind of a person. There's not much. Another reference, 23:9. Speak not in the ears of a fool, for he will despise the wisdom of thy words. I remember Bill Peterson preached on Proverbs, and you remember what his 3 words were? A despiser.
I thought it was meathead and airhead.
Yeah.
I wasn't remembering.
No.
Meathead, airhead.
Egghead was his one for the wise person. We call brains eggheads. So meathead, airhead, and hothead. That's what it was. Meathead, he's stubborn. And the airhead, he's just ignorant. The hothead, he actively resists. Those were good illustrations. I forget which words went with which. He told me he got it from Hebrew. It's good. 17:10. A reproof entereth more into a wise man than 100 stripes into a conceal. Right? Not that the person can't be taught, but he's sure there's not much hope. And then the third kind is a naval, a worthless person who is also wicked. I think the naval is the hard case. He's the hothead, like Nabal was. He got really angry at David. He suggested that he give him some food and stuff. Chapter 17, verse 7. Excellent speech becometh not a naval, much less do lying lips a prince. And verse 17:21. He that begets a naval doeth it to his sorrow, and the father of a naval has no joy. No joy. Chapter 30, verse 32. If thou hast done foolishly, that is, if you've acted like a naval in lifting up yourself, or if you have thought evil, lay thine hand upon thy mouth. The reason being is because you'll get what you deserve. There's another word for fool that Solomon uses, but it's only used in the book of Ecclesiastes. And this apparently is the final stage. Sakal is the word. It's a person that's beyond hope. He destroys himself. Okay. All right, key phrases in the book. Well, you'd have to include the my son references, 23 of those in the book. There's another 20 references to son without my prefix to it, so that's quite a few references to the son. Right? A few examples. Chapter 1, verses 8, 10, and 15. My son, hear the instruction of thy father. My son, of sinners entice thee, consent not. My son, walk not thou in the way with them. Refrain thy foot from their path. Okay, I think we'll leave, we should add to the my son references the fear of the Lord. I don't know how many, I forgot to look that up. But that's there a few times. All right, theme and message of the book of Proverbs. John Phillips contrasts wisdom and folly. He makes the observation that there are 6 Hebrew words for wisdom in this book and 3 Hebrew words for fool. Unger, in his handbook, says that the book of Proverbs is a compendium of moral and spiritual instruction. A compendium of moral and spiritual instruction. started a few years ago when in my preaching. I made up my mind that I was going to try to bring something from the book of Proverbs into every message, because you can't. It's just that it takes time to find it. I haven't followed through on that, but for a while I did. If you want to summarize the principle of any other particular passage in the Bible, you can always find something from Proverbs to put it into simple form. It's good stuff. I was noticing they did that on one of those films the other day too.
Yeah, the whole film. Yeah.
Yeah, it's good. You can really preach the gospel from the book of Proverbs. At least the
part.
Yeah. It's good. I would say that there are probably a dozen major sub-themes in the book. Wisdom is the general theme, but here are major applications of it. Love versus hate. And diligence versus slothfulness. Honesty versus dishonesty. Proper versus improper speech. Joy versus sadness. Marriage versus fornication. Parent-child relationships. Giving and receiving advice. Who you listen to. And the individual and the state, or the king and his subjects, or politics, however you want to state it. That's another. It's kind of interesting, the principles from Proverbs that you take that you can be applied today. Solomon warned against insubordination and anarchy and stuff like that. He also indicated that the spiritual nature of the king determines the nature of the countries. It's pretty important. These are the major ones I focus on when I preach through it, and they're practical. Okay, we'll pick up next class with the relationship of the book of Proverbs to the rest of Scripture.